Okay, Adab, welcome to our series, Islam After Colonialism, which is co-sponsored by Habib University's Department of Comparative Humanities and the University of Exeter's Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. I'm Nauman Naqvi. Allow me to briefly introduce the series. Islam After Colonialism, the reason we felt the need for this series is because across the world, modern colonial rule has not only devastated the economies and ecologies of non-Western societies, it has dramatically transformed their cultures and traditions in innumerable ways. From the replacement of metaphysics and spirituality by historical and political religions to the emergence of divisive nationalism and nation states, the contemporary world cannot be understood without the profound impact of modern white supremacist colonial rule based on modern ideas of racial and cultural segregation, historical superiority, and the civilizing mission, and national competition for global power and progress. So this fortnightly webinar series is meant to explore not only the radical transformation of regional Islam during the period of modern apartheid colonial rule, but also the living potentials of the pre-colonial past, as well as the urgent decolonial question of what is possible today, what can we do, and how can we live now. So our series has three parts, as it were. So we address various lectures in the series have addressed the pre-colonial past. Colonialism, of course, is a continuous reference or focus. And then there is the post-colonial, which is more in the realm of possibility. And so you could also call it, on the one hand, the historical, analytical, and critical part, and on the other, the therapeutic or the reparative part, which is the post-colonial or the possibility of a reparative future. I have a sense that our talk today will actually probably address all three dimensions. So now I'll turn to my colleague, Professor Sajjad Rizvi from the University of Exeter to introduce our distinguished speaker for today.
Thank you, Nauman. And you know, one of the pleasures of curating a series like this is that you can invite friends, old and new, for a conversation. And of course, make new friends as well. So it's a real pleasure to introduce a friend, Ali Altaf Mian, who is Assistant Professor of Religion and Izzat Hassan Sheikh Fellow in Islamic Studies at the University of Florida. His research interests are broadly in South Asia, gender and sexuality in modern Islam, and the intersections of Islamic law and ethics. He's published extensively in various journals relating to that. But he's in particular working on two main projects, two monograph projects, which came out of his doctoral research. One is a book on Muslims in South Asia for Edinburgh University Press, and the other one is entitled Surviving Modernity, Ashraf Ali Thanvi and Islam in Colonial South Asia. And I think that they will both make a very significant contribution to our study of Islam in South Asia. Today, Ali has given us this title, Beyond Victorian Sexuality, Intra-Muslim Contestations over the Erotic in Colonial and Post-Colonial South Asia. And of course, I'm pretty sure that it will speak to not only our study of the colonial, but also go beyond to the decolonial and to the reparative. So without any further delay, please, Ali.
Thank you so much, Professor Rizvi and Professor Naqvi. It's a pleasure to be a part of this wonderful series. And I'm very much looking forward to sharing some thoughts on the question of sexuality in Muslim South Asia and getting feedback from the two of you, but also from the broader audience. So what I'd like to do is to address one of the central questions of my research. How is it that the ulama cultures are not covered in the scholarship on sexuality in South Asia on the one hand, and sexuality does not figure into the scholarship on the ulama cultures in South Asia on the other hand? So this is the disciplinary exclusion that I'm naming and trying to analyze. And it really has to do with secularity informing our assumptions about sexual life, right? Sexual freedom and sexual life on the one hand, and the neglect of the body in how we conceive of the discursive tradition on the other hand. So the analytical dividend of this talk is really to deconstruct and to ameliorate some of the problems with the category of sexuality on the one hand and the category of the discursive tradition on the other hand. And I'd like to begin with 4 epigraphs that allude to different themes of the talk. And I won't really get into the epigraphs, but hopefully they will um, implicitly inform what is to follow. The first is this passage from the Quran: of humankind are some who attach themselves to God's rivals, loving them with a love befitting God alone. Those who believe are stauncher in their love for Allah. This epigraph really brings to the fore the question for me that can be imagined: religiosity as sexuality, or sexuality as religiosity. Why are the two so different in the global public imagination and the global cultural and political imagination that it's almost become an impossibility, at least with reference to Islam and Muslims, to imagine religiosity as one's sexual orientation? The second epigraph comes from one of my favorite books on the history of sexuality by Arnold Davidson. He says, by claiming that there is no natural object of the sexual instinct, that the sexual object and sexual instinct are merely soldered together, Sigmund Freud dealt a conceptually devastating blow to the entire structure of 19th century theories of sexual psychopathology. So really, this is the ethical-political challenge of sexuality at the intersection of religion, that how do we conceive of um, modern sexuality as having no natural telos and orientation and anything goes, but religious normativity has its own ideas about licit and illicit pleasures. The third epigraph comes from Jacques Lacan, his seminar, Desire and its Interpretation. All access to the object, to the sexual object, insofar as it depends on a combination of partial drives, is fundamentally problematic in nature. So Lacan really names the subject's inability to know what he, she, or they desire. Can we really know the epistemology of affect? Is it available for epistemic capture, right? So this is the problematic that Lacan really brings out in his work. Finally, the idea that bodily pleasure should always come from sexual pleasure as the root of all our possible pleasure, I think that's something quite wrong. And this is Michel Foucault's critique of psychoanalysis. So those are the epigraphs. My work is largely centered on the prolific oeuvre of Ashraf Ali Thanvi, who was a Muslim theologian in colonial India. He was a Hanafi jurist and a Chishti Sufi who authored many books. In one of his brief treatises, which is titled Tamyiz al-Ishq min al-Fisq, on the distinction between eros and sin, he looks at ishq majazi, metaphorical love, and ishq haqiqi, real love in the Sufi tradition. And he acknowledges some sort of a positive valence function of ishq majazi or metaphorical love, but then also disciplines metaphorical love. And in disciplining metaphorical love, this is also bodily or carnal love that serves as a bridge to love for the divine. In disciplining bodily or carnal love, Ashraf Ali Thanvi comes across as a moral theologian who is committed to discipline and order, betraying his preference for legal normativity in terms of Muslim jurisprudence and his socio-historical conditioning as a colonial subject. So when we read colonial discussions of or colonial era Muslim discussions of desire, there are two different frameworks that are appealing, but what I will argue is that we should really resist them. One is to read these representations of affect, passion, desire, intimacy as modeling or mimicking Victorian sexuality. Another paradigm, analytical paradigm, is to read them as um, embodiment of colonial discipline and order, or the internalization of colonial discipline and order. And I think both of these are problematic analytical frameworks. However, if we employ a trans-genre reading strategy, we see the complexity of desire itself within Muslim traditionalism. So when we read across genres, we see a different Ashraf Ali, and the two genres that my illustrations will come from are the hagiography genre and the malfuzat genre. The malfuzat are the recorded conversations of a Sufi master. These genres attempt to capture ordinary affects and everyday tactics that individuals and communities deploy to navigate the demands of the normative order, but also the demands of the body. These ordinary life genres thus flesh out representations of subjectivity in a more adequate manner than legal edicts and theological treatises. The following illustration, so the first illustration is a conversation between Ashraf Ali, the Sufi master, and his disciple Mufti Muhammad Shafi, who before the partition of India was the head Mufti at Darul Uloom Deoband in the United Provinces. After the partition, he came to Karachi and he founded the Darul Uloom Karachi in Korangi. He died there in 1976. His two sons, Mufti Rafi Usmani and Mufti Taqi Usmani, are now at really at the vanguard of the Deobandi institutions in Pakistan. So this conversation captures how Ishq agglutinates the moral subject to charismatic religious authorities and their teachings, and how bonds of affection form between co-religionists. Mufti Muhammad Shafi records in a collection of malfuzat. In one of his sessions, Maulana Thanvi mentioned Maulana Wasiullah Fatehpuri, who was another disciple of Thanvi. He died in, I believe, 1967. He was based in Allahabad, but also had a wide following in Bombay. So he mentioned Wasiullah with great love and affection, and thereafter asked me if I knew the latter. This stay in Thana Bhavan made me realize in the depth of my heart the preeminence of my former classmate. Both were classmates at the Darul Uloom Deoband. So he says it made me realize how, Wasiullah is more loved by Ashraf Ali. But at the same time, I found myself in a state of remorse and regret. I've yellow highlighted those two words because one of my purposes in this talk is to highlight representations of affect. For I had delayed becoming a disciple of Maulana Thanvi. When he asked me this question, I could not help but utter the following couplet. Majnoon and I were schoolmates in the classroom of passionate love or ishq. He went to the desert while I became disgraced in the alleys. So the desert is the imagined space par excellence for annihilation, annihilation in the divine. And so this is an excellent example of how Persian mystical and literary and aesthetic sensibilities survive even among Muslim traditionalists who are otherwise seen as basically obliterating the culture of Persian adab. But we see this again and again in Deobandi sources from the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Upon hearing this couplet, Ashraf Ali uttered the following sentence with his distinct pleasure. I'm going to read the sentence in Urdu, not because I want to demonstrate my linguistic, capacities, but because you can only pick up on the literary device being deployed here if it's read out. So he says, हाँ यहाँ यही दस्तूर है कि किसी को सहरा दिया जाता है, किसी को सेहरा दिया जाता है, हर एक को जो कुछ अता हुआ है, इस पर राजी रहना चाहिए. So the word play is on two words that have a similar sound, at least in spoken Urdu, but they are really different in terms of their philology. So the translation is, yes, according to the policy here, one aspirant is given the desert while another is given the bridegroom's turban. So Ashraf Ali is saying to Mufti Muhammad Shafi that don't be remorseful for not experiencing my love in the same way that Shah Wasiullah has experienced, because I've given you the bridegroom's turban. Yet each should be content with his particular gift. This really brings out a different scene of embodied sovereignty, the sovereignty of the charismatic authority, right? That should also figure into discussions of political sovereignty. Derrida, for example, really has a lot to say on ipseity, right? The independence of consciousness as basically the primary scene of sovereignty. Before sovereignty becomes a political concept, sovereignty is experienced by the subject as ipseity, the independence of one's consciousness. So this play between Sahra and Sehra, it is really involving two literary devices. One is Mudara'a and the other is Tajnis. Mudara'a is similarity of sounds whose articulation, makharijul huruf, is close. And Tajnis is the homonymic pun, alliteration, or assonance. It's really fascinating that Ashraf Ali, his malfuzat, his khutbat, his mawa'iz, and his writings in general, they are full of word plays, some of which include tajnis and mudara'a. And so what, if we are able to contextualize these literary devices, we can ask, what are the implications of tajnis for a Sufi master in colonial India? And here I draw from Abdul Fattah Kilito, who says, plays on words bear witness to a search for equilibrium and harmony. So there is something in the colonial context that is pulling Ashraf Ali in several different directions, right? An embrace of maybe ishq majazi, an embrace of ishq hakiki, the desire to implement order and discipline, but also the desire to revel in basically incalculable affect. So Kilito says that plays on words bear witness to a search for equilibrium and harmony. They support the coherence of poetic language. Tajnis joins what is similar and allows a continuity which puts an end to the fragmentation of the parts of the poetic text. My second illustration comes from a hagiographical text, and this is going to be a long quote but it's new. It comes from Azizul Hasan Ghawri's Ashraf al-Savani, which is the 4-volume biography in Urdu that he wrote for his Sufi master. Azizul Hasan Ghawri himself was a poet, and he was called Majzub, the intoxicated, but also one could say the madman of love, the madman of Sufi love. So he says that during one of my bouts of passion, I'll actually go to the next slide in which I highlight the traces of embodied affect. So he says that during one of my bouts of passion, ishq ke josh mein, I submissively said to his sanctified presence, Hazrat Wala, with much trepidation and shame. So he said to Ashraf Ali Thanvi, a severely obscene idea continuously crosses my mind, and the thought of expressing it inflicts me with shame and cowardice. His sanctified presence was walking from the courtyard to the prayer hall. This is within the Khanqa, within the Sufi lodge of Ashraf Ali in Thana Bhavan in the United Provinces. And he said, don't hold back, say what's bothering you. This meek person with his head lowered said to him, I keep on wishing that I was a woman married to your sanctified person. My expression of love brought utter joy to his sanctified presence, and he inadvertently burst out into laughter or in laughter. He entered the prayer hall while uttering these words, for this love of yours, God shall reward you. Indeed, God shall reward you, God willing. His sanctified presence still remembers this amorous incident. He occasionally mentions with much pleasure this meek person's love-filled words in his blessed daily sessions, in his majalis, and amusingly says, what a blessing that you did not wish for the opposite situation for me to be your wife. So of course, a lot is involved here, and one can write an entire article unpacking this because there is a certain gender hierarchy. But how I would like to read Ashraf Ali's amusing statement at the end is that Ashraf Ali himself considers it possible that the master could also be seen as the wife in the relationship, right? And he uses the subterfuge of the joke to express something that is taboo. But actually, elsewhere in his writings, he's very open about comparing the Sufi master and disciple relationship to the relationship between husband and wife. Where this passage comes up in Ashraf al-Savani is when Azizul Hasan Ghawri is discussing what he calls faiz-e batini, the spiritual the spiritual grace of Ashraf Ali that basically he transmitted to his disciples. But he also puts right next to this passage, he puts this Persian couplet, which translates as, lovers' conversation about the action of God reflects the fervor of passion, not irreverence. So he is mindful of not coming across as be'adab, irreverent. And it is the idea of the love shared between a Sufi master and a disciple as a proxy for the love of God that allows him to make intelligible this experience of wishing that he was in marriage with Ashraf Ali. Now, this Persian couplet is actually what I call a displacement or an elusive paraphrase of another couplet that is in the third volume of Maulana's Masnavi, so Rumi's Masnavi Ma'navi. And I want us to look at the displacement that happens. So the yellow is from Rumi. Rumi says that these analogies drawn by imperfect men concerning the action of the Lord are like the emotion of love. They are not from irreverence. They are not from irreverence. But had Azizul Hasan Ghauri repeated the couplet from the Masnavi, he would have implied that Ashraf Ali is from the Naqisan. So then he changes uh, Naqisan, the imperfect men, to Ashiqan, right, the lovers. And also he changes Qiyas. Rumi says, in Qiyas Naqisan, these analogies drawn. So it's not logical, or it's not really conversational, or it's not parlay. It's not a certain back and forth that is going on, but it's more an amorous conversation, and that is why he says he replaces qiyas with guftugu. So this really captures what I think happens in the Deobandi sources, that when they engage with the Persian mystical tradition, they don't, it's not an isomorphic or a one-to-one citation, but what happens is elusive paraphrase and a certain displacement. One could also call it a translation that allows them to cite the authority, but also the mystical aura of the Masnavi into their local context. I want to now ask a question that, is this affective assemblage recognizable in or to or for the scholarship on South Asian Muslim traditionalism? So here we have an image, a picture, a surviving picture of Shah Wasiullah Fatehpuri lecturing to his disciples. And I think we don't really have a picture of Ashraf Ali, but Shah Wasiullah, for some Deobandi Sufi theologians, came really close to imitating the presence of Ashraf Ali. So this affective assemblage, that this image and also the two illustrations that I've discussed exemplify, is this affective assemblage recognizable, legible in the scholarship on South Asian Muslim traditionalism? Do the labels modernist reformist or traditionalist reformist or embodied revivalist or Sharif cosmopolitanism or charismatic Sufi, do these labels do justice to the affective assemblage? Another question we could ask is that, are such affective assemblages recognizable and legible to or in sexuality studies and queer studies? Do we call what we find in our sources repressed homosexuality or Victorian prudery or homosociality, to recall Sedgwick's scholarship and her thesis about Victorian relations between men? Do we call it homosociality? Do we call it queer religion? Do we call it transgender? Or do we call it alternative sexuality? Here, I'd like to draw on Ray Chow, and I'd like to explore the methodological imperative, but also the resourcefulness of resisting our own disciplinary impulse to name affect. And what does that do to the scholarship, right? Can we have a mode of analysis that acknowledges its inability to render affect legible? Because whenever we name something, as Ray Chow says, we are basically producing similarity. She says, by naming something, we confer upon it an identity it does not otherwise have. An identity by which what is named becomes animated as our relation, our equal, our community. We should also resist the intrigue of the open secret, right? We should resist the idea that I am unveiling, or we are unveiling these sources and bringing out their open secret. We are basically So this is basically to resist the analyst, the scholar, the critic becoming a voyeuristic analyst. And here I draw from the work of Anjali Arondekar, who calls for a careful hermeneutic dealing with the archives of sexuality. Arondekar interrogates the evidentiary and historical status of various source materials, arguing that instead of turning to the archives to reveal the open secret of homosexuality, a turn that reinforces the heteronormative imperatives of the epistemological structure of the closet, we should see the archives as sites of indeterminacy, conflict, and multiplicity. And for me, the ethical political challenge here is really the following question: how to affirm globalized sexual identities garbed in the politicized language of human rights and freedom and dignity of the individual, while also affirming those forms of intimate life and expressions of desire that sexuality as discursive machinery forecloses and or marginalizes. Some resources that I think can help us navigate the double bind at the intersection of Islam and sexuality include the Lacanian distinction between desire and drive. So Lacan makes this distinction, which I believe is very important when we deal with the category of sexuality in the non-West, because he says that desire always remains unknowable and we can never name sexuality. At the same time, desire always expresses itself as a demand of the drive. And these are nameable actions, nameable inclinations. He doesn't go as far as saying that they should be organized into an identity, but he does recognize that the subject has epistemological access to some of her, their, or his desires. And I think the Lacanian tension between desire and drive, it really allows us to navigate those sites of social life and intimate experience where a certain desire refuses legibility within the frames of sexuality that are authorized by the modern West. We could also deploy a transgenre reading strategy, a reading strategy, and then we could turn to alternative categories of analysis that do not reinforce the biopolitical regime of sexuality. And these categories include intimacy, desire, attachment, love, and so on. But there is a problem with alternative categories, which is, from what position does an organization of intimacy become hegemonic or alternative? In other words, whose classificatory purview determines the center and the periphery of sexual life? While it is important to draw on interdisciplinary resources in psychoanalytical queer theory to navigate the double bind, ultimately the challenge is to find ways to talk about human bodies and desires without privileging the categories of Western sexuality and the disciplinary formations that have analyzed the historical emergence of sexuality in the modern West. Of course, we live in a globalized world, and many people in non-Western societies have embraced Western forms of sexual identification. Yet the fact still remains that those who refuse to think of their erotic lives within the framework of Western sexuality are often reduced to one of the reactionary operative categories of this very framework. And sometimes they themselves use reactionary categories to name their sexualities. What results is a system of citations that perpetually forecloses the diverse range of human erotic life. And I want to turn to how Deobandis and other Muslims in modern South Asia and contemporary South Asia, they actually perpetuate this foreclosure of the diversity of erotic life. And I analyzed that at length in this article called Genres of Desire that you can consult. But I want to now turn to the contestations of the erotic or the sexual in contemporary, in post-colonial South Asia. Here we have just one illustration of how ulama cultures actively oppose sexual freedom. And this is, broad, this is basically a, across the spectrum of sectarian identities, Barelvi, Sunni, Shi'i. So ulama cultures in general, they they have taken a stand to oppose sexual freedom in contemporary South Asia. But then we also find the ironies of sexuality fueling intra-Muslim sectarianism. This is just one example of how some of the sources that I have discussed, they are plugged into Deobandi Barelvi polemics fought online. And this, in this YouTube video, which is about 20 minutes, you have the example of a Barelvi theologian based, I believe, in the UK, condemning two other Deobandi theologians who are also based in the UK, but the fulcrum or the axis of condemnation of the other's maslak is sexuality, right? So sexuality as represented in the archives of the Deobandis become the fodder to marginalize them, and they do the same thing to others. And here we see another online contestation of the erotic in ulama cultures, which this is a blog post which reads, Deobandi scandal, Rashid Gangohi and Qasim Nanotwi lying in bed together as lovers. Another contestation from a very different perspective is the feminist artist Naiza Khan's Heavenly Ornaments, which is a deliberation, an artistic and an aesthetic deliberation on the work of Ashraf Ali Thanvi, especially his Behishti Zever or Heavenly Ornaments. And here she really, I think, explodes what it means to constrict and restrict and sublimate sexuality. So Thanvi, Ashraf Ali Thanvi, he sublimates carnal pleasure into divine pleasure, but Naiza Khan really challenges how any regulatory apparatus to restrict sexuality cannot really control or contain sexuality. And I think this one art piece, which is a changing sculpture that the artist displays in different modes, it shows us the mobility of sexuality itself, or desire itself, or carnal pleasure itself. And so Naiza Khan's feminist engagement with Ashraf Ali Thanvi should also be seen as an intra-Muslim contestation of the erotic. And if you want to know more about how that happens in the work of Naiza Khan, I've written about that in a piece called Displaced Ornaments, Naiza Khan's Critique of Sexual Difference in Muslim South Asia. Let me now come to the conclusion, which is really the intervention in terms of what my argument does to two different bodies of scholarship. On the one hand, ulama cultures remain excluded from the literature on sexuality in Muslim South Asia, and on the other hand, sexuality remains excluded from the literature on Muslim traditionalism in modern South Asia. So the assumptions that guide the scholarship on sexuality in Muslim South Asia, and the reason why the ulama are excluded, in my view, they are the following. The ulama are seen as dry and cerebral. They are seen as legalistic. They are characterized as having a disembodied practice of religiosity. They are characterized by apathy. They are characterized as repressive and as homophobic. The illustrations that I have shown from colonial India, they complicate this. But the illustrations that I have drawn from social media, online social media, they actually reinforce this. So this is not a critique of the scholarship on sexuality in Muslim South Asia, but it is a deconstruction of it. Because what I'd like to point out is that the alleged equivalence between sexuality and secularism, secularity, shapes these assumptions. Secularity basically sees sexual freedom as one of the features of the liberated individual, the self-autonomous individual who has been liberated from religion. One of his, her, or their freedoms is sexual freedom. And I think that the equivalence between sexuality and secularity, it colors this scholarship. Some of the assumptions about sexuality, which is seen as alluring but disposable, that account for its exclusion in the scholarship on Muslim traditionalism. The first is identity politics. A lot of scholars stay away, historians of Islam in modern South Asia, they'll stay away from the category sexuality because of identity politics, which basically means you have to be one to study one. And people in the American Academy, such as Robin Wiegman, they have in her book Object Lessons, they have really complicated and problematized this assumption, both its pros and cons, that do you really have to be one to study one? And who is this one that we're talking about? Are we not reinforcing the regime of modern sexuality when we say you have to be one to study one? Do I know which one I am? The stuff, and then sexuality is also seen as the stuff of juicy scandal and it is seen as neo-imperial because it's controversial and Western. There is also the problematic that as object of study or as source material, sexuality is problematic because it's based on speculation and scant evidence. But really, this too assumes what is sexuality and what is not. If we embrace the intimate, the erotic, the affective, then the source material really opens up, right? It can become an object of study. So the exclusion of sexuality here reveals what scholars assume about what Talal Asad calls Islam as a discursive tradition. The very conceptual configuration of the discursive tradition fails to attend to the lived, embodied, and affective dimensions of religiosity. This is why Assad himself updates this concept by appealing to the idea of the sensible body in his 2018 book, Secular Translations. So my conclusion is I leave you with this question and an attempted answer. What does the disciplinary misfit between ulama cultures and sexuality reveals? For me, it reveals two things. On the one hand, the sustained power of secularism and secularity to shape our understanding of human desire itself. And on the other hand, the Cartesian neglect of the body that undergirds the concept of the discursive tradition. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that really scintillating, inspiring talk. So much to think and talk about. So much was resonant also. I mean, I kept on thinking, if I may start with a share from Ghalib, है तमन्ना का दूसरा कदम कहाँ या रब, है तमन्ना का दूसरा कदम कहाँ या रब, हमने दश्ते इम्कां को एक नक्शे पा पाया. This is with respect to your point about the illegibility of desire. So in the realm of possibility, desire, the realm of possibility is the first step of desire only. So its entire journey is actually then illegible. It's in the domain of the impossible. Yeah, the journey of desire actually is in the region of the impossible, most of the journey of desire. So that would make it illegible. Yeah, Ghalib reflects on, and the ghazal tradition in general, of course, continuously reflects on desire. Ghalib has so many shares about tamanna, and this, of course, continues with that famous line from Noon Mim Rashid, tamanna ki wusat ki kisko khabar hai jahazad, who knows the expanse of desire. So the expanse of desire is, frankly recognized, both in Ghalib and of course Noon Rashid, being in the modernist tradition, of course, has read Freud and all of that. But Ghalib already points to the fact that there is this consciousness of the illegibility and the mobility of desire. Yeah, that's just taken for granted in the tradition. And this is something that was at the heart of the, as you know, no doubt, of the critique of the Ghazal. I mean,
Yeah.
I was recalling also this remarkable incident from Sayyid Masood Hassan Rizvi Adib's Hamari Shairi, which is a defense of the Ghazal, and he recounts how there was a Maulana who had written a love poem, as it seemed, for a boy. So he said to the Maulana, he said, you know, yeah, aapko zeb nahi deta, this does not become you to write such a love poem. So the Maulana was utterly shocked. He said, what do you mean? He said, I wrote this poem for my boy, 10-year-old boy who died. And I was longing for union with him in heaven. Yeah. So in that milieu, Sayyid Masood Hassan Rizvi Adib, of course, also educated in that milieu, colonial milieu, completely misread something that of all people he should have been most familiar with. Yeah, such was the force of these new ways of thinking about desire. I mean, and this is a quotidian fact. Really, I'm struck by how quotidian this is. I mean, the very language of desire that we have. So if I said, "मैं अपनी अम्मी को बहुत चाहता हूँ," nobody would bat an eyelid. But the moment you translate that into English, a literal translation would be, "I really desire my mother," and you would think, "Oh, this guy's got a problem." Right? So desire is just precisely as you're saying. And this continues to be a quotidian fact, despite this, all of these distortions that you're talking about. So those were some of my comments, stimulated by your very scintillating, and it helps us make sense a lot of this very, very significant. I mean, earlier on in this same series, we had Manakia, and she was talking about homo amicus, the kinds of friendships that existed, in this earlier milieu, and the nature of desire. In there, she was alluding to that. But I had a question about this, what you were saying when you use Kilito, where Kilito is saying that the play on words is indicative of a search for harmony. I was a little puzzled by that, because I would have thought that you would usually think of plays on words as disrupting. What should one say? Being polysemic. And polysemia is actually disruptive rather than harmonious.
Yes, I think that the disruption is located in everyday, ordinary, affective life. And language is one of the mechanisms that helps us to give a certain legibility or order to that chaos. But as the very mechanism that restores a certain order to the chaos of being, it enacts its own certain displacements. But this is where at one time Ashraf Ali says, "Ke aaj ke liye bas," we can't handle poetry anymore. So in his majalis, they would have these sessions in which Majzoob, Azizul Hasan Ghauri from Lucknow, would recite his own poetry, or the poetry of Maulana, or the poetry of Hafiz, or the poetry of Saadi. And then Ashraf Ali would say, "Aaj ke liye bas," because the subject has a certain withstand, or a certain, I think, limit that the subject has to maintain in order for subjectivity to be legible to herself or themselves or himself. Do you see what I mean? So I completely agree with you that language, it enacts its own displacements, and sometimes it doesn't harmonize. But one could say that language gives us the fantasy of harmony and order, which doesn't, and I think that a critical analysis would deconstruct um, the displacements that it inaugurates, even in its attempt to harmonize. With reference to Professor Kia's term homo amicus, there is something in Ashraf Ali, which is really, I think, one of his contributions to Muslim thought. And here I'd love to hear from Professor Rizvi as well. He says that the human being is not hayvan aqil, we are hayvan ashib. And that really translates to homo amicus. So I think that the scholarship on Muslim South Asian traditionalism really has to reckon with the survival of ishq, even in traditionalism. Because the question here is that what happens to modern Deobandi institutional life when their self-desired image becomes an impossibility because of because of the traces of alternative forms of sociality that persist in the sources that they also embrace. And that's the question I've been struggling with for the last decade, that how not to totalize a discursive tradition and to see its fragments and the fractures that its multiple genres and scenes of social engagement make possible. But yes, I think that, but everything, the earlier illustrations you gave from Ghalib and Anam Noon Mim Rashid, and also the discussion of Hamari Shairi, I will have to look those up and they're very useful for me. So thank you.
If I may add one more thing to that, it just strikes what you said just strikes one as so true. Yeah, I mean, because in fact the ulama speak very, very openly about sexual matters, about erotic matters, and recognize. I mean, even Tariq Jamil on television itself, yeah, when he speaks about the Huris, it's very, very deeply, I mean, famously so, yeah, very, very erotic. And if you see videos of him with his disciples, etc., they're all over him physically. It's a highly erotic in that sense. Yeah, the entire scene of traditionalism, yeah, as it were. Yeah.
Yes.
Sajjad.
Yeah, thank you for that. Extremely fascinating, not least because, again, I can see so many different ways it speaks to our kind of decolonial intent, but also raises some questions about perhaps what the limits of that kind of decolonial gaze, so to speak, might be. I mean, the interesting point you made about, hayvan ashik as opposed to hayvan aqil. I mean, this, of course, goes into a much longer trajectory of how aql and ishq are juxtaposed. And I guess the problem, of course, that we have is precisely this assumption that, what we need in kind of modernist kind of regimes and orders is rationality and not kind of love or desire or passion, because those by definition are emotivist, right? So you've got this kind of rationalist versus emotivist juxtaposition happening, and that in a sense is not the point, because again, there's not a huge amount of work being done on this with respect to philosophy in Islam, but it's gradually building up that what is affective includes the rational, right? So it's not the case that you've got reason versus passion, but rather you've got a number of different ways in which humans behave, are affected by one another, are motivated by different things, and each of those motivations can have a rationale, can have a narrative, can have an explanation, regardless of whether one calls it aqli or otherwise. So I think that's a very interesting point, and certainly I think I mean, Maulana would absolutely 100% agree, because of his own very negative understanding of what the aql is. On the other small point about the tajnis that we are discussing, I mean, I think it seems to me this is again, you could say this is again kind of Aristotelian thinking versus Neoplatonic thinking. So Aristotelian thinking desires for us a deep commitment to metaphysical plurality, right? And to order. So the idea that language orders, language explains, that languages have grammars, languages have structures, and so forth. But actually the way in which normal human life works is a bit more complicated than that. And even if it seems to be chaotic, it's not chaotic because it's harmonizing insofar as it recognizes that there is a wider harmony, right? So, someone like Ibn Arabi extensively uses tajnis and other devices. He uses kind of plays with etymologies and so forth. And this is not out of some deconstructionist attempt to maybe kind of displace and make language unstable, but it's merely to recognize that everything ultimately is connected, right? Yeah. That those connections are not, they don't seem strange. They seem strange to us only because they exist out of the way in which we sort of structure connections, right? But insofar as they recognize connections, they actually have their own structure. So they have their own order. And that's, it's a bit like the classic kind of philosopher's distinction between, the ratiocinative intellect and the simple intellect. So the simple, the kind of divine intellect, knows everything at once. There's no order in that. Doesn't need order. Just knows everything, right? But human intellects have to go through a process so they can order things, so they can understand how things relate to each other, so they can build up knowledge and understanding about something. But the simple intellect, the divine intellect, has no need for such things, right? So I think it's that kind of, ijmal tafsir almost kind of way of looking at categories, actually. I mean, I think that might be an interesting way of looking at the ijmal tafsir kind of approach to categories. There's loads of things. I think this is fascinating. It's this, especially when you're bringing up the poetry, I kept on thinking of that kind of, that literature which kind of bores me on the ghazal as pederasty, right? Or the culture of the ghazal as pederasty. And I still find it astonishing when people still repeat this sort of, I think, rather limited understanding of whether it's Persian ghazals or Turkish or Urdu, whatever. Of course, but I wonder, for example, how are we using this term sexuality? Because I was aware of some of the points you were making about, for example, the issue about separating bodily pleasure and sexual pleasure, right? Now, it's not to deny that there is embodiment and there is bodily pleasure, but if we separate the two, then in what sense is the term sexuality different from the term love? That's, I guess, my question. I mean, are we basically just putting the term love? Are we just putting love and sexuality as the same category, same term?
It would be. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, that was my question in a sense. Yeah.
Right. I think it's the institutional and the scientific, specifically the psychiatric life of usage of that term, of the term sexuality. Love, desire, eros, they have separate trajectories, but Foucault's diagnosis is that sexuality is a packaging of a certain type of human desire that is then biopoliticized by state institutions and becomes an avenue or one of the loci where the state really carries out its management of populations. And so the very construction of a certain demography into a population it requires sexuality as one of the tools. And we see this especially in the US and in Western Europe. So I would say that, you know, sexuality, it can mean orientation, it can mean identity, but it can also mean a certain inclination, and it can mean act. And this is the triangulation between orientation slash inclination, identity, and act that is helpful to think about what do we mean when we use the term sexuality. And my usage of the term, it recognizes how at once there are huge problems with it, but the very term is a scene of exclusion. And so when one tries to recover or to be reparative, one has to both critique the violence that sexuality, the regime of sexuality, does to the multiplicity of human desire, but one also has to then make a case that modern homophobia structures our relationships with this legacy.
Yeah, I mean, and I sort of, I can see that, especially since, I mean, this is kind of a much more kind of complicated issue of how we then trace the sort of history of this, because, you know, one thinks, for example, of the particular history of the way in which, you know, you have the category of the Ishq al-Zurafa, from someone like Ghazali all the way to Mullah Sadr, and also all the way actually arguably to also to Shah Waliullah, right? And the Ishq of the Zurafa, you know, talks, you know, mixes the language of Ishq Haqiqi, Ishq Majazi.
Yes.
But of course, the object of the Ishq al-Zurafa is always a boy, right? And it's always described as being superior, and is also, of course, associated with the you know, the tradition of Shahid Bazi and so forth. So I guess that what I'm saying is that how, in a sense, would your critique help us make sense of that history, of how we talk about it?
Yeah, I have not, I mean, I know of that history, but I have not thought about that particular question. How does this critique help us to think of that longer trajectory? Because I think it goes back to something that Nauman was also saying, that when he was talking about his third illustration, Sayyid Masood Hassan Rizvi, you know, the modernists and the reformists in colonial South Asia, like Hali and Shibli, this becomes really a problem for them, because now they have to reckon their different inheritances with a certain colonial preference for heterosexuality, and heterosexuality that fits into a certain mode of production that is connected to capitalism. And so it becomes, you know, this idle individual, or the individual who, the idle individual, and the individual who spends too much time romanticizing cannot really be productive for the modern progressive social order of tarakki, of progress. And so they try to either religionize, or they try to maintain silence, or they try to denounce it, but it does become a problem for them. And I would have to think more about the longer tradition that you're talking about, because it goes back to, you know, the Greeks, about the organization of the coupling of sexual acts with power relations, and how, but that's a trans historical, or that's a broader historical question that I do not really have the expertise in terms of languages to look at how it has evolved from ancient Greece onwards. But here the problem I'm trying to name is really how what does this exclusion, double exclusion, reveal about our assumptions about sexuality and secularity and the discursive tradition? And the reason why I really said something about the discursive tradition is because it's become such a powerful analytical framework to discuss Muslim traditionalism, you know, from Talal Asad, but also from after him, on the scholarship that has really blossomed on ulama cultures in modern South Asia. And one thinks of, you know, not just Sunni ulama cultures, those written by written about by Zaman and others, but also about Justin Jones' work on Shia Islam in colonial India. So that's really, I think, the area that I'm most comfortable addressing broader theoretical and methodological and source-based issues.
And I think you're absolutely spot on about this kind of, I guess, modern construction of what the alim is supposed to be. And the fact is that most of the ulama past and even some of them present are actually a bit more sophisticated than that, right? So, you know, I think for most people kind of want to see the ulama, as you've mentioned, as and even some of them, of course, do come up in social media as being like this, you know, sort of selling fatwas, being very legalistic, being kind of very rapacious and lustful and so forth. But then, of course, you also have ulama who perfectly understand what a ghazal is and perfectly understand that ghazals and taghazul affects many other kinds of genres of writing, right? And, you know, it's the taghazul, for example, take a marsiya. You cannot understand a marsiya without concepts of taghazul. It's absolutely impossible. You know, large chunks of a marsiya make no sense suddenly if you take that out of the context. The way in which, you know, the ulama kind of, I guess, orchestrate certain kinds of rituals will suddenly make no sense. So in that sense, in terms of getting a more sophisticated understanding of how ulama cultures work and how these retain meaningfulness for people, I think that's the other thing. You know, sometimes people assume that this stuff isn't meaningful, you know, that what happens, you know, in the sort of majlis that you're talking, you know, you've got this guy sitting, everyone's sitting around him very close, or, you know, what happens at a shrine, etc. People assume that you know, the modern sensibility is completely estranged from this. But I think maybe one of the points we want to make is that, well, why should that assumption be the case? There may be some people who have no idea what's going on, right? But there were always vestiges of things which exist in all sorts of experiences. And sometimes it's even a question of, oh, yeah, I remember what that means. I understand that, right?
Absolutely. And I think what you are saying, how they retain meaningfulness, a point of my research is to show that communal formation in many of these socialities and institutions of clerical life, communal formation happens through the affective bond. And the reason why people cling to their traditions is because there is a long affective investment. Their traditions are their sources of pleasure. So this is why it's really colonizing for people in the West to think that, you know, certain bodies that have the visible signs of religiosity are devoid of sensual experience and love and affect. There's such a violence in that assumption, and I wanted to name that violence because it really goes to, I think, what Foucault also argued: what bodies are legible and recognizable, as being sane within a certain Victorian sexuality, and who are the perverts and who are the queers within that organization of sexuality. But after the sexual revolution of the 1960s, the Muslim body has increasingly figured has changed from being a hypersexualized body to basically either being an asexual or a repressed body on the one hand, and the only way out of that on the other hand is for Muslims to embrace the modern categories of sexuality and forms of life and ways of ways of consuming culture that are authorized as legible within the grammar of Euro-American sexuality. And that's, I think, the key problem. And of course, people like Joseph Massad have written on this, but they're not dealing with the types of intimate lives that do survive and that do animate Muslim communities, right? So how can we affirm on the one hand what people do in a globalized world, which is their prerogative and they should do whatever they want to do, but also affirm other bodies as being more complicated and as having their own, participating in their own arrangements of pleasure and desire and so on.
Should we?
Go?
Yeah, please,
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
So yes, I wanted to actually, given your reference to Malfuzat, the most famous romance, of course, between a master and a disciple is between Nizamuddin Aulia and Amir Khusro. And when you were talking about Mufti Muhammad Shafi, his jealousy for the other disciple, I was also thinking of Khusro's often expressed jealousy with the Hasan Sijzi, who was the other favorite disciple. But also thinking then of the fact that, seamlessly fits into the idiom of Virha Bhakti, of the Gopis' love for Krishna. When you were talking about Mufti Muhammad Shafi wanting to be married to Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi.
Oh, sorry, Azizul Hasan Ghauri.
Oh, Aziz Al Hasan Ghauri. Right. Yeah, so the desire to be married to his master. That, of course, I mean, there are so many songs that are sung by Amir Khusro in which the relationship is precisely performed in that fashion. Yeah, but what's interesting to me is that the idiom there, just that it's always fascinated me. It's both beautiful and remarkable that that idiom, which on the one hand is distinctively Islamic, it's also distinctively bhakti. Yeah, it's the gopis love for Krishna. Yeah,
that's fascinating. I've just gotten several new books on the new scholarship that is trying to think about bhakti at once as erotic and devotional. It's somewhere over here. I can't. I don't remember the name, but that is really fascinating, and thank you for that, because I think that the Deobandi sources that I read, they do refer to Hazrat Nizamuddin and his relationship and love for Amir Khusro. And the biographer of Azizul Hasan Ghauri, he actually analogizes the relationship between Ashraf Ali and Azizul Hasan Ghauri to the relationship between Nizamuddin Aulia and Amir Khusro. And this is the way that I think, I'm really indebted in a sense, in many senses, but in one sense to Sajjad, because he's one of the people who has pushed me to problematize the reliance or the over-reliance on Western epistemic frameworks. So I think that to think anti-colonially and decolonially is to take seriously what does that allusion to the 14th century by a early 20th century, how do we interpret that? What type of a citation is that? And what work does it do? And I think that you're identifying that it comes from a shared sociality that Muslims shared with Hindus. This is really crucial because that sociality gets negated within Deobandism. There is a certain I think self-inflicted containment and a certain desire for demographic purity that I'm thinking as you were speaking, that this Hindavi poetics doesn't persist in the same way, and they might be turning more to Persian mystical poetry to actually claim a space of being Islamic, that their reliance on the poetry of Hazrat Amir Khusro might take them into. Do you see what I'm saying? So I think it's really you saying that it's both Sufi devotional or Islamic devotional, but also bhakti. That's really, I think, opening a new question for me.
It's also fascinating to me that such a translated, to get back to one of the earlier talks by Shankar Nair in this series, that such a translatability existed, yeah, as if, the very possibility of these resonances existed, didn't come into existence, but actually existed and just happened in that way historically. Yeah, it's as if there was a shared ontology of desire. Yeah, and which I don't know. I know constructivism is all the rage, but to my mind, I think that that's the right ontology of desire. After all, this is what human life is about. As long as you're alive, you desire, and what you desire is the most important thing in life. And you, of course, don't always know what you desire, which is precisely what you spend your life trying to figure out. And so I think the pre-moderns, and of course the pre-modern doesn't just disappear once modernity comes on the scene. Nothing happens like that. It's a process of sedimentation. Past layers might be obscured, but they're still active and available, etc. Yeah. So it seems to me that there is this shared ontology of desire in the past, which just disappears in the modern period. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And how does communalism inform and shape the foreclosure of that shared ontology of desire? That's fascinating. Thank you for I think bringing this up, because they want the citational purchase and the citational authority that comes with putting themselves in the same framework as Nizamuddin Auliya and Amir Khusro, but then there are other affiliations and identifications that trouble them, and I should investigate how do they disassociate themselves from the fullness of those inheritances.
This also begs the question of how we use terms like Deobandi. So, in fact, there's a question in the chat. Aruj Alam was asking about Thanvi's conceptualization of desire with Munazir Hasan Gilani, and the question there is this like normal in the Deobandi tradition, or is this exceptional? And I think if you were going to look at it from the perspective of now, in the way in which we tend to look at Deobandis, we would think this is kind of unusual, right? That this sort of sociability, this sort of, just basic living, sexuality, practice, religious life is unusual. But then I think that's because we have got used to, especially in recent decades, of considering Deobandi in a very narrow sense, right? That Deobandi has certain associations. So even if someone, for example, introduces, like if you had introduced Ashraf Ali Thanvi as a great Deobandi figure, right? Immediately people would have in their mind all sorts of connotations and associations, right? And in many ways, what you then presented would go completely against those assumptions and associations.
And it would also go against the self-image that is desired by, I would say, the overwhelming majority of self-identifying Deobandis in contemporary and the diaspora. So I don't think it's exceptional. What I think is happening is this, that, and it's really, I think, a question of what is sayable and what becomes unsayable in different historical periods. So I think when people are writing in the late 19th and the early 20th century, the full discussion and the almost proud discussion and of these issues and representation of these issues is very much within the realm of the sayable, because the modern regime of sexuality has not really been mapped onto these forms of life. In the post-colonial period, especially in the last 20 to 30 years, any sign of homosociality, male-to-male desire, extramarital heterosexual desire, all of these forms of desire, they will become a source of stigma, and so their expression has now been transferred to the realm of the unsayable. But they still persist in private communications, and there are scandals that have happened in Deobandi institutions. And I'm not talking about the abuse of students that happens in all madrasas or many madrasas. I am talking about very specific scandals within Deobandi Sufi orders that are also Naqshbandi. Some of them are Naqshbandi. And there was a certain case of a Sufi sheikh who has a lot of Deobandi followers having relations with his female disciples, and Mufti Taqi Usmani and Darul Uloom Karachi had to step in, and they offered a very long fatwa that was not published, but it was circulated on social media and WhatsApp, in which they cited from the Malfuzat and the Khutbat of Ashraf Ali to actually say that there's no space for these relations in Tasawwuf or in institutional Sufism. So that's one example. Another example is the Deobandi Sufi theologian master Hakim Muhammad Akhtar, who died in Karachi in 2013. I believe it was 2013 or 2009, one of those 2 years. But yeah, I believe it was 2013. He basically, his maktubat, his correspondences now have been published, and they are called Tabiyat-e Ashiqan, and his maktubat are full of basically him advising people how to leave a beloved of the same sex, right? So what is new about, and Ashraf Ali does the same thing, but what is new is that homoerotic desire is now attached with gay identity by Hakim Akhtar, and Ashraf Ali did not have that vocabulary. And so I think that one of the broader questions here is that the proliferation and the neo-imperialization of Euro-American sexuality categories, it is really restricting the range of the erotic in Muslim majority societies, because to become affiliated with a form of desire that has some semblance to Western sexuality becomes a form of stigma. And so I think that the globalization of Western sexuality is one of the sources of increased homophobia in Muslim majority societies. So that's my answer to Arooj's question, that this is not exceptional, but it really has to do with our source material and what at a given particular historical time they can or they cannot express, or they choose to express or not express.
That's really true. It's actually very, very dramatic. The change, for instance, in the status of Khaja Siraz in Pakistan, just over the past 20 odd years, the kind of violence that has emerged against transgendered Khaja Siraz is, unrecognizable. I mean, never saw anything like that. In the first half of my life, I never heard of such a thing. Yeah, and then
Actually, I'm sure you know of Shoresh Kashmiri, who was a Deobandi sympathizer, but also a renowned Urdu literary figure. Shoresh Kashmiri wrote a book called Us Bazaar Mein, in that market, where he talks about the bazaar of flesh, and that's a semi-ethnography of the Khwaja Siraz, but also the courtesans of Lahore. And so there was, what is really fascinating is that the courtesan culture in the Khwaja Siraz claim religiosity and speak back to Shoresh Kashmiri, and he acknowledges that he's learning from them, and he even like tries to interview someone called Amir, who was a courtesan visited by Iqbal, and he tried to say, tell us something about Iqbal's proclivities, and she says, I will not speak anything about those who have left the world. And Kashmiri keeps on imploring her for some sort of juicy detail, and she has sealed her lips. And that's really fascinating, because it shows that that recognition of sexual and gender diversity was possible even by Deobandi sympathizers around the middle of the 20th century. But now the stigma is so much that, I think the publicized and the social, and what goes around on social media, it becomes really a circuit of generating more and more stigma for gendered and sexual minorities.
Thank you. Yes. Sajjad, do you have anything else?
I'm just aware that we're at about 5:30, so
yes,
maybe we should let Ali have some lunch or something. Or
Well,
I think this has been absolutely fascinating. It's been a very rich talk, and I have seen the other article, the History of Religions one, but I haven't seen the Reorient one, so I'm going to go off and download that and have a look at that. But I think this has been absolutely fascinating. There's so many contributions, rethinking how we look at sexuality, desire in this way, in a decolonial way. Secondly, rethinking the way in which we look at ulama categories and even confessional categories like Deobandi. I think that's extremely rich, and it's actually rare to see that kind of sophisticated lens on modern Muslim South Asia, to be perfectly honest. There's far too much nonsense out there on contemporary South Asia, often coming from people who are primarily trained as political scientists. Have a little dig at them. So cool. Well, thank you
so much. Thank you both to Professor Naqvi and Professor Rizvi. This has been a treat for me, and your comments and questions, they have given me also a lot to think about.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
And I guess that just leaves me to just quickly announce that our next talk is going to be by Simon Fuchs, who will be talking about the enduring appeal of an Islamic state after colonialism. So I'm looking forward to that. We have two more talks in our kind of, I guess, spring session, and then we'll have a program over summer as well. Well, moving towards summer. So yes, hopefully see everyone again on the 25th of March, and so in anticipation of that, Saleh Nom Mubarak, Nowruz Mubarak, for the coming new year, which I I think still a lot of people do still celebrate that in Pakistan and in India, as they should, because it is their new year as very much as it is the Iranians' New Year. So Happy New Year, and hopefully see you all then in a couple of weeks. Thank you again.